Hi, my name is Dale Maley. Today in this short video I'm going to explain how I recently built a relatively simple gun cabinet that will hold up to 5 guns or 5 rifles. Now in my project, my design objectives, I want to keep the design as simple as possible with capacity to hold 5 rifles. I want it to be lockable using a cylinder style keyed lock. I really didn't want any clear display plexiglass or glass in the case. I wanted to keep this low cost and make it from common pine. As I said before, I want to be able to hold up to 5 total rifles. I want to have a shelf to keep ammunition in. I want to use plain 1x4 pine boards. The panels on the case for the cabinet, I want to use standard 1x4s. And then for the floating panel inside, I'll use 3/16 inch thick Luan plywood. I'll use the Kreg pocket screws to be able to build it relatively fast and easy. Pine's very difficult to stain, so I found one solution I use is a fruitwood stain, and I follow that up by 2 coats of polyurethane. I'm going to design it to hold my 39-inch long Henry 22 caliber Golden Boy. And I have enough room that future rifles could be up to 43.5 inches long. Here's a drawing I made of this relatively simple gun cabinet. It's going to be 14 inches deep, 20 inches wide, and the overall height will be 63.25 inches. I'm going to put the ammunition shelf on the top. It'll be 14 3/4 down from the top of the cabinet. I will use 3/16 inch thick Luan plywood panels for the left hand side, right hand side, and the back. For the front door, it's going to be solid pine. I'll put 3 hinges on the left hand side, and I'll bore a hole and put a cylinder style key lock on the right hand side. Now if you wanted to hold more rifles, you'd have to increase that 20-inch width accordingly. If you want to hold rifles longer than 43.5 inches, you'd have to increase the overall height of 63.25 accordingly. On my cabinet, I'm going to start out with the ammunition shelf on the top part of the cabinet. But later, if I decide it'd be better to have it on the bottom of the cabinet and then have the rifle stored above it, I can still do that because I'm going to make the shelf removable just using some wood screws. And then on the bottom of the cabinet, I'm just going to have the bottom of the guns resting on the pine wood bottom. You could always add carpet or felt to the bottom if you wanted to. Now here's a drawing showing my typical panel construction. And as I said, this will be the left hand side, right hand side, the back, and the top. I'm just using plain 1x4 pine, which actually measures 3/4 inch thick by 3.5 inches wide. Technically those are called rails and stiles, the frame pieces. Then the center, I'll have a floating panel, and it'll be made from 3/16 inch thick Luan plywood. Now let's remove one of the frame pieces on a panel and just see what it looks like inside. So on the left you can see my 3/16 inch thick Luan plywood, and then the groove that holds the plywood, or technically called a rabbet, it's 1/4 inch wide and 3/8 deep. And I allow some clearance, so I have the Luan usually extend about 1/4 inch into the groove. That leaves an 1/8 inch just of tolerance. And then to hold the outer 4 frame pieces together, at each joint I'm going to use 2 of the Kreg 1 1/4 pocket screws. And I put those on the inside of the cabinet because I don't want those to show on the outside. I'm fine with them showing up on the inside. Here's a picture, an old picture of my Kreg pocket screw system, and you can see the blue piece that's clamped to my workbench. And what that does is let you drill an angled hole down into the wood for the pocket screw. And I found this lets you build things very quickly compared to the old traditional methods of using things like dowels, mortise and tenon joints, etc. So it's a relatively low cost, and I've used it on lots of projects, and like I say, it lets you build things very quickly. Probably the most challenging thing to do on this project from a woodworking and tools perspective is how do you make the 1/4 inch wide by 3/8 deep grooves or rabbets that hold the Luan panels. Well, as in woodworking, there's always many ways to accomplish a goal. One way is just take your table saw with its normal blade, which is probably about an 1/8 inch wide, and then make 2 or 3 passes to make your 1/4 inch wide groove. And you can probably set it to cut at 3/8 depth, okay. So maybe it takes 3 passes on the table saw for each board. What I did, I have a dado set, which is nothing more than stacking some saw blades together, and I set those up so just in one pass on a board I could cut the 1/4 inch wide and 3/8 deep grooves. Another option is to use a router table with a 1/4 inch wide router bit. Again, you'll probably have to make 2 or 3 passes to get 3/8 deep. Or you could go old school and use a hand router as well. Now on this project you need one shelf and one bottom. On my design they're both the same size. They're 17.5 inches wide and 12 inches deep. What I did was glue up some of the standard 1x4s, then run them through the table saw to get the right dimensions. Another option would be to use plywood as well. Now you do need one door on this project, the front door, and on this design is 12 inches wide and 52 inches high. Again, I made that from just gluing up some regular 1x4s and then sawing them to size on the table saw. Another option you could use is to use plywood. Another piece that's needed on this project is a notched piece to hold the tops of the rifles in place. Again, I started with a piece of 1x4 and then sawed it to 2.5 inches thickness, and then I cut in the notches as shown here using a bandsaw. You could also use a scroll saw or a manual scroll saw as well to make this piece. The last assembly you have to make is the bottom assembly, made out of 3 pieces. I used 1x4s for these. It shows that my corners here are 2 inches before you start the notch there. I think I actually use 3 inches. It doesn't really matter. And then you use some 45-degree cuts at the 2 front. On the back, those are just sawed off at 90 degrees because you don't see the back of the case because it's going against a wall. Now once you make the 3 pieces for the bottom assembly, you need to really beef those up because they take quite a bit of force as you're sliding or scooting the cabinet around on the floor. So a typical design that I use, I cut 2 45-degree pieces as shown in the upper corners. I glue those in to the bottom and then I screw those into the cabinet. Then I also use those 4 right-angled brass-colored pieces, and technically they're called chair braces. They're available at any woodworking supply company, and they really help to beef it up. And the cabinet actually only sits on the inner 1/4 of the bottom frame, which is 3/4 of an inch wide. But that's plenty, and it works fine. About the last remaining task in building this cabinet is to install the hinges, and you need to cut out some hinge pockets, or mortise pockets they're called, for the hinges. Again, as in most woodworking, there are several ways you can do this. The old-fashioned way is simply take a hammer and a chisel and you chisel out the pockets. You could use a router, or you could use a Dremel that has a router attachment. In my case, I chose to use a manual router, actually made by Lee Nelson, a woodworking tool company, and it's shown in the picture here, and it actually works very well. So although pine is the cheapest wood to make this cabinet from, the downside of that is I find pine is very difficult to stain. What happens is you don't get an even stain, you get blotches. It just doesn't look very good. So a method I learned many years ago from my father-in-law is to sand it down to 220 grit, nice and smooth, and then brush on, in this case, a fruitwood stain. And normally you'd wipe the excess off with a rag. Well, in this method, you don't. You just leave it on. The last thing you do is take some long brush strokes with the grain, and then it'll take a while, but it will dry. Then on top of that, put some semi-gloss polyurethane, oil-based product. Let that dry. Hand sand it to 220 grit, and then put on a second coat of polyurethane, and you'll end up with a nice looking, very smooth finish. You do need to allow more time, like 24 hours each, for the stain and polyurethane coats to dry. Now here are some photos of my finished cabinet. On the left hand side, it's a front view with the door closed. You can see by the coffee cup the scale, or it's about as tall as my refrigerator, not quite as wide. Then in this middle picture, I have the door open and with a .22 rifle sitting in one of the notches in there. And then the picture on the right hand side, that's actually the back of the cabinet. So in summary, this video explains how to design and build a relatively simple and lockable gun storage cabinet. And feel free to modify this. This is just a general concept. You could make it wider or taller. You could use, instead of pine, you could use oak or walnut. And if you want a clear acrylic piece or glass in the front door instead of solid plywood, you could do that as well, all with the same design. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe. Thank you.